The political crisis in Sri Lanka deepens. First, the president sacks his prime minister. Now he dissolves parliament and calls for snap elections. Just how far will this power struggle go, and is democracy in danger? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. He sacked the prime minister. Now he's dissolved parliament and called for elections in January. Sri Lanka's president, Maithripala Sirisena, has been accused of violating the constitution. The turmoil was triggered last month when he appointed former leader Mahinda Rajapaksa as prime minister. The man he sacked, Ranil Wickremesinghe, refused to leave the prime minister's residence. The case is expected before the Supreme Court on Monday. We'll discuss with our guests the effects all this could have on Sri Lanka's stability. But first, Manel Fernandez reports from Colombo.
The constitutional crisis continues here in Sri Lanka, and basically it's two parallel realities. It just depends on whose version you listen to. Now, rippers continuing about President Sirisena's dissolving of parliament at midnight on Friday. The president has defended his decision, saying it's in keeping with the constitution. He did what was legal. That is what we heard from his foreign minister, Sarith Amanugama, who briefed the media earlier today. However, the Wikremesinghe camp of ousted Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe saying that this was illegal, complaining that there was no constitutional provision to call an election after dissolving parliament. In fact, the group went to meet the chairman of the Elections Commission, Mahinda Rajapaksa, this afternoon, presented their case, and they say they expect the commission to be meeting and discussing and acting in accordance with the constitution. Now, this being the weekend, obviously, we're hearing that a number of petitions will be submitted to the Supreme Court on Monday, and the Supreme Court will be expected to give direction as to where Sri Lanka goes from here. Manel Fernandez, Inside Story.
All right, now over to our panel in Beijing. Xiudong Jia, researcher on Asia-Pacific affairs and a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. By Skype in Kerala, Sri Lanka's former electoral district, Rajiva Wijesinha, a former government official, and in London, Charu Hogg, an associate fellow at the Asia program at Chatham House. Welcome to you all. Rajiva, let me start with you today. What the president in Sri Lanka has done, first by sacking the prime minister, then by dissolving parliament, how much of a surprise has all of this been?
Well, both steps came as great surprises, but partly because of the timing. You know, there was a strong school of thought that after the Prime Minister's party did extremely badly in the February elections, there was time for a change because it seemed to be bringing down the government. But there was a lot of kerfuffle at the time. And then it was only, as you know, in October that the president took a step that perhaps he should have taken earlier. Now, in taking that step, I think he assumed that he would have a parliamentary majority against the prime minister. But there has been toing and froing up and down. There are allegations of buying MPs on both sides. And I think there was a sense that perhaps some sort of vote of the people might sort things out. So to everyone's surprise, last night he dissolved parliament and has fixed an election for January. But in both cases, there has been doubts about the constitutionality of the actions. And it seems best perhaps that, well, now the second, but even the first, should have been taken up before the courts for an interpretation. And I hope that happens quickly so that we can get over this uncertainty.
Charu, there are some that are saying what the president has done is unconstitutional, and there are some that are arguing that it is constitutional. From your perspective, what do you say? Does the president have the power to do all this? And is this ultimately going to be resolved in the Supreme Court?
Well, absolutely. From where we are sitting and we are looking at it, and indeed the perspective of Sri Lankan constitutional lawyers is that this is an illegality. All three steps are unconstitutional. The dismissal of Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, the appointment of Mahinda Rajapaksa as the Prime Minister, the proroguing of Parliament, and then finally the dismissal of Parliament. All these steps are regarded and considered unconstitutional. And the question here is whether the Supreme Court will show the independence and the neutrality to decide that the January elections, which have been unilaterally announced by Gazette, by the President, are to be upheld. And I think that is really the issue.
Xiudong, let me get your perspective on all this. So there is an argument that is being made that Sri Lanka was already in a constitutional crisis and that the dissolution of parliament is really the only way out of it. What do you say? Is that really the case?
Well, you know, as we in China, we are watching the events taking place in Sri Lanka, you know, what we in China would like to see is a kind of political stability in Sri Lanka, because as historical experiences in China have shown that with political stability, we can see economic development and improvement of the well-being of people. So, you know, naturally here in China, when we look at all the, this kind of constitutional crisis, people here would like to see that the people in Sri Lanka can work out their internal strife so that they can focus on economic development and improvement of the people's life. As a principle in Chinese foreign policy, China doesn't interfere in internal affairs of any countries, including Sri Lanka. So certainly it calls on all parties in Sri Lanka to work out their political differences. And China has enjoyed friendly relations with Sri Lanka, no matter who is in power. So China is not taking side with regard to the current political situation in Sri Lanka. What China would like to see is that they can deal with it and solve it as soon as possible, so that they can go back to economic development.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
social progress.
Let me just ask you a quick follow-up, building on what you were saying. When it comes to China's relationship with Sri Lanka, is that dependent on who is in power?
No, actually, it's as a principle, no. Actually, we have seen sometimes ups and downs in China's relations with some countries, including Sri Lanka. But, it always as a principle, China respects the choice of the people in Sri Lanka, who they would like to elect. And so China can work with these governments. Even, in the past few years, we have seen that some China-invested projects have experienced some problems. And, some people may have different opinions about the projects, but China respects, the final decision of the government of Sri Lanka, whoever is in power there. For example, take the Hambantota, the port project. Now, in the administration of, former President Rajapaksa, and the project was developed there. Later on, when the new administration came in power, they said, well, they needed some time to review the project. That's fine. And finally, it was decided by the Sri Lanka government that they should move on, because that's good for the economy of Sri Lanka. It's good for the long-term development goal of Sri Lanka. So now the project is in operation, and it will be, provide jobs for Sri Lanka. By 2020, it's presumed that maybe 10,000 jobs will be created directly, and 60,000 jobs indirectly will be created for the people in Sri Lanka.
Rajiva, let me ask you, building on what Xiudong there was saying when it comes to the economy, I mean, what are the concerns right now in Sri Lanka as to how much all this turmoil will affect the economy?
Well, the economy was in a complete mess before this turmoil, partly because there was, or I would almost suggest, some sort of dysfunctionality in the approach of the former Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe. Take the issue of China. I'm afraid the West also is to blame because when Rajapaksa was in power, they actually accused him of giving in too much to China. But I believe the relations between Rajapaksa and China were very positive for Sri Lanka. Sadly, when Wickremesinghe came into power, he was very insulting about China. But China behaved very well and in the end has given more aid and support to Wickremesinghe. But I'm afraid on harder terms than the support they gave Rajapaksa. And, it's all nonsense. I was on Indian television last week and they said, the appointment of Rajapaksa was an attack on India. And I said, that's absolute nonsense. But I did find very odd the remark of the Indian TV channel. The Indian foreign minister is much more circumspect to say that, since China had a port in Hambantota, India should be given this terminal. But Wickremesinghe seems to have committed that to India without consulting either the cabinet or parliament. And the Minister of Ports and Shipping, who should have been consulted, made it very clear that he felt the East Terminal should be developed by Sri Lanka. But he was happy on reasonable terms to offer India the West Terminal in Colombo Port. As it stands, a lot of the productive investment in Sri Lanka has come from China. I personally believe the terms on which the Wickremesinghe government got it are not as much in Sri Lanka's interest as was the situation earlier. So I hope that there'll be a healthy corrective. You're probably aware that the Sri Lankan rupee, which was at 150 to the dollar, slid to 174 when Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister. And in the Colombo business community, there's a sense that, he and his team have absolutely no idea of how to handle the economy. Mm-hmm. So the general sense is that, Rajapaksa is a more popular Prime Minister. With regard to the constitutionality, our problem is that in 2015 there was an amendment. Some Wickremesinghe's proponents wanted to give back all power to the Prime Minister. And this was emphatically not what Parliament wanted. So there's a lot of ambiguity. I think Charu Hogg is correct in saying there's some ambiguity with regard to the dismissal of the Prime Minister and indeed the dissolving of Parliament. It's ambiguous. It's not cut and dried. But there's absolutely no doubt that the President had the full powers to prorogue Parliament. And it was partly because of the rather unwarranted interference.
Rajiva, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Rajiva, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to ask Charu to pick up on a point you were making. Charu, Rajiva was talking about constitutional amendments that have been made in Sri Lanka. And indeed, a few years back, there was a constitutional amendment. There was a change to the Constitution in which power was taken away from the president and there was more power given to Parliament. So how are we in this situation today?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the current president has stretched the interpretation of the Constitution to its widest limit in taking the power to both appoint a prime minister without proving in Parliament the loss of majority by the current prime minister, and in appointing summarily the new prime minister, appointing Mahinda Rajapaksa as the prime minister, he has certainly taken a decision which stretches to the extreme limit that the current prime minister fails to enjoy his own confidence. So yes, indeed, this president took it upon himself to check the powers of the executive presidency, but we have seen also how this has been violated and absolutely taken to the limit. So you had scenario A, in which an attempt was made to dismiss the prime minister without observing the due procedure and the due process laid down in Parliament. That plan failed because there wasn't, the bid was to have buy over MPs, by creating a situation where parliamentary majority could be proven by Mahinda Rajapaksa. But that attempt clearly failed. And this is plan B, which we are seeing in action, which is in the form of the dissolution of the parliament. Why have we reached this impasse now in terms of, despite the checks on the position of the executive presidency, why are we seeing this unfold? I think it's really a question of the way governance has evolved in Sri Lanka, how rule of law has been bent through the years. I'd like to pick up on another point which was being made earlier about, how and whether, Mahinda Rajapaksa is seen as somebody who's close to the Chinese, and the role that the Indian government plays in this whole imbroglio, and what correlation the current political situation and political crisis in Sri Lanka will have to the regional dynamics. I think that's an important point to be explored. And let's not forget that in 2015, when Mahinda Rajapaksa lost the election, one of the determinant factors was the way in which he had worked with the Chinese in terms of securing Chinese investments and the debt that the country got into. So that was a decisive factor. In fact, the current president, Maithripala Sirisena, used that in as part of his election brief as well. So there is a backdrop, a shadow of the regional politics, which has always played within the national crises that unfolds within Sri Lanka. But however, this is it, and it will continue to play a role. But whether this is the determinant factor is a different issue altogether.
Xiudong, let me go back to some of the points that you were making about the economy and the economic relationship between China and Sri Lanka. Look, right now, there are concerns that there could be violence in Sri Lanka the longer that this plays out. This is seen in some circles as threatening potential development projects. What do you say to that?
We all know that Sri Lanka has experienced decades of violence, wars, conflicts in the past. We were all glad to see the end of civil war many years ago. With the end of civil war, Sri Lanka could focus on economic development. Of course, there are different political parties in Sri Lanka arguing for different ways of governing the country. Even for the current leadership, they have different views on how to develop the country, how to run the country. But the question is that they should try to find a way out of the current crisis. All the external forces, powers, countries, should stay away from this internal political struggle. They should not interfere in internal affairs of Sri Lanka. Let the people in Sri Lanka decide their future, decide their government. Even for Chinese projects, actually, so far we haven't seen any negative impact on that. But of course, political unrest certainly will take a toll, if there is any, take a toll on economic development project, especially China invested major projects there, which are good for the future of Sri Lanka.
Rajiva, what are the repercussions that are being felt on the ground in Sri Lanka right now? How are citizens reacting to all this?
Well, there's actually a great sense of relief. I'm out of Colombo now. What I would call the elite in Colombo seems to be very pro-Wickremesinghe, but not the business community because of, I think, the disappointing performance in the last few years and the massive corruption. While there are claims that we're in debt to China, the proportion of debt to China is not particularly large, and we've had a large number of development activities. But as you're probably aware, soon after this government came into power, there was a massive scam with regard to bonds in which Wickremesinghe and his party made a lot of money, billions. The case is still going on. And the governor of the central bank he appointed who is being sought by the police, has taken refuge in Singapore. And there were allegations that, he was behind a lot of the bribery that took place. And the country was really quite horrified by that. And that is why Rajapaksa on his own, got more votes in the local government elections in February this year than both the President Sirisena and the Prime Minister. And, I was one of those who actually supported Sirisena against Rajapaksa, one of the first to cross over without any benefits. But I did find that the way Wickremesinghe took over and the corruption and also the failure of really any coherent economic policies has led to a sort of dissatisfaction. And in the country at large, and in particular amongst public servants and in the rural areas, I think this move has been welcomed. So I think that the president, in taking some bold decisions, has actually made it clear that he's supporting democracy in the wider sense while remaining within the framework of the Constitution. Charu Hogg is correct in suggesting that he's stretching the powers of the president to the limit. But what the West hasn't registered is that Sri Lanka still has a presidential system where the head of the state as well as the government is a directly elected president. And it is up to the president to work in the interests of the people. Now, the Supreme Court, I hope, will make a quick decision. But I think what the West is terrified of is that if there were a general election, Rajapaksa would, his party would win the general election by a massive majority. I personally would be happier if the present government, Sirisena Rajapaksa, continues, but with a strong opposition. But sadly, that will never happen while Ranil Wickremesinghe is the head, because he's practically destroyed his party. So I hope that we can move forward quickly with a strong government and a strong opposition.
Charu, where do things go from here? What happens next? And can there be a positive outcome from all of this?
Well, I think it is a situation of complete crisis and meltdown in Sri Lanka at the moment, politically. The dissolution of the parliament has created a situation which can be resolved only by the Supreme Court. There is very little faith that there will be a free and fair election, given the way that the constitutional issues have been manipulated at this point in time. To say, I think another important issue that should be brought into the mix, since we are considering the totality of issues in Sri Lanka, is the fact that that Mahinda Rajapaksa, who has been unilaterally appointed as the Prime Minister, is somebody who faces allegations of crimes against humanity and somebody who presided over an army which engaged in egregious human rights violation.
Yeah, these are very serious allegations, right, Charu?
Civil war. These are very serious allegations. There is an entire constituency in Sri Lanka, which is the Tamil and the Muslim minority community, which is full of fear with the prospect of the return of Mahinda Rajapaksa. Sri Lanka is not just about the majority Sinhalese community. Sri Lanka also consists of the Tamils and the Muslims and Christians who are equal and democratic citizens. The second point I just like to come back on is very quickly, is that when we talk about the mandate of the people and how people are relieved in the country, if this was the case, then why aren't the parliamentarians supporting Rajapaksa? Why did the president have to take the step of dissolving the parliament? Because they could not prove the majority in parliament. Why has the Tamil Nationalist Alliance, the UNP, and indeed a series of parties, including the biggest Muslim party, come out strongly saying that they feel that this is an unconstitutional move and would like the Supreme Court to resolve this? So let's look at things. Let's not adopt a partisan view here. Let's look at things in black and white. What has emerged in parliament? There are not enough MPs who are standing up and saying, we want Mahinda Rajapaksa as the Prime Minister. That's the reality. The second reality is that the dissolution of the parliament is unconstitutional. So, I think the facts speak for themselves. Where do we go from here? I think we are all looking at the Supreme Court to offer some guidance and to take Sri Lanka out of this mess, really. And to say that the Western governments and countries have a vested interest. I think everybody is united in the view. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's just that we have run out of time, so we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Xiudong Jia, Rajiva Wijesinha, and Charu Hogg. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.